Hey everyone, this is a section from the final chapter of Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's Western Marxism and Introduction. The section is from is titled Outlook and Preview, the Dialogue, Sociology and Marxian Theory. And the section is titled Dialogue 2, and it starts with a quote from Max Ernst. And if you don't know the song, Max Ernst by, Mission of Burma, you should listen to it. It's dope. Quote, order of experimental exploration in search of an authentic consciousness or drunken boat. Amidst every bloody uprising, she blossomed full of grace and truth. Max Ernst. What appears in linguistic theory as the paratactic pattern manifests in the sociological domain as a disjunctive ordering of the social and the mental. Consequently, the discipline fragments into various specialized subfields, the so-called, quote, hyphenated sociologies, unquote. In contrast, classical sociology had to confront the problem of grounding the discipline and establishing its unity. For Durkheim, Simmel, and Weber, this involved a shared rejection of the classical reduction of the social to psychology, brain research, biology/physiology, or physics, and crucially, the adoption of a value philosophy that was itself conceived as functionally rooted in the social realm. For the conceptualization of sociology as a system of distinct disciplines tended to treat society merely as a field of application. The problems arising from this proliferation of specialized sociologies prompt a reconsideration of the discipline's unity. There are three main responses to this situation. 1. Conceiving sociology as philosophy. That is, understanding the science sociale in the way Diethard had urged in his debate with Durkheim, as a philosophy of the social sciences, while drawing in part on the Scottish school, Ferguson, Millar. 2. Undertaking an imminent reconstruction of sociology, drawing specifically on elements of social research methodology, taking the qualitative social research associated with critical theory, with a capital C and T, as a starting point in order to arrive at a critical sociology. 3. Moving toward a dialogue with Marxism, engaging with both its cooperative dimensions and its internal ruptures. While the first point would require a broad research perspective, points 2 and 3 are more closely interconnected in a specific way. One second. Footnote. The following remarks stem from a process of discussion involving Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner. They have been revised here by Diethard, Behrens for the final version. Footnote. After the end of the Second World War, it appeared that both sociology and Marxism, in whatever form or theoretical articulation, had been marginalized. Nevertheless, a debate began to re-emerge. Setting aside for the moment the unique status of critical theory within the academic system itself, one must refer to it insofar as it constitutes a form of social science theory. This is exemplified by studies on the quote, authoritarian personality, which address socio-structural factors, mindsets, behavioral dispositions, prejudices, general consciousness, and psychological constitutions, all of which are to be explored through qualitative analysis. Furthermore, the methodology common to the natural sciences, characterized as nomothetic and historically insensitive, it is itself now subject to criticism. Here, there is an affinity with the critique of positivism found in the later phase of critical theory. Critical sociology implicitly connects to this, partly by directly building upon it and partly through theoretical approaches developed independently. The problematization of traditional social research methods centered on the following elements. Measurement by theory, the various survey methods, which rarely go beyond capturing surface phenomena, the scope of theoretical terminology, and the language of theory, as well as the respective transformation calculi, the scope of survey techniques in social research, and their partial inadequacy regarding the societal and social consciousness. Hartwig Berger and Jürgen Ritzert also developed their critiques with reference to Marxist discussions, and specifically regarding the problem of a Marxist, quote, empiricism. Another approach is presented via the theory of, quote, symbolic interactionism, end quote, as a concept of action originating with H. Bloomer and G. H. Mead. At its core, it revolves around behavior, identity, language, roles, and family discourse. Human identity formation, viewed as a social process, takes place through communication as symbolic interaction, wherein symbols are intended to function intra-physically, much like general concepts. Here, the subject matter of the social realm is linguistically centered by emphasizing symbol-mediated action. Furthermore, the status accorded to symbols as cultural entities in Durkheim's work is modified, such that societal characteristics, language, and social situations act as modifying variables, thereby complicating any direct access to or direct conceptualization of the subject matter. Quote, ethnomethodology, end quote, refers to an approach within the tradition of phenomenological sociology that focuses primarily on groups and communities based on two underlying assumptions. These are A, everyday practice as a field of inquiry, and B, language and action. This sociological theory seeks to understand, quote, social facts, faits sociaux, as the outcome of interaction processes. In doing so, it employs indirect methods as well. One of these is its, quote, crisis experiment, which entails a critique of norm-guided linguistic interaction. In, quote, action research, the relationship between the scientist and their object, the classical subject-object relation that embodies the traditional separation characteristic of scientism, with a transmundane scientist as subject and an object to be measured, is transformed into a, quote, active interaction, quote. This is because both researcher and subject belong to the same domain, that of human existence. Thus, the practice of the social scientist itself becomes a subject of inquiry. Action research is always at the same time a critique of empirical social research. Surveys appear dependent on theoretical frameworks, yield nothing more than measurements of the range of variation. Quote, action researchers criticize traditional social research. Quote, action researchers criticize traditional social research not only for its lack of connection to reality and the ideological manipulative use of results by those commissioning the studies. For them, social power relations are also reflected in the methods of social research itself. End quote. That quote is from Dormit Kramer, Helmut Kramer, Silvio Lehmann, Action Research, blah, blah, blah. This critique also targets empirical social research as a, quote, technocratic instrument of domination, end quote. Crucially, however, there is no adequate definition of the subject matter. The goal of action research itself is the, quote, learning process of the research participants, end quote. It is the researcher's participation in the interaction process of everyday life, a form of practically engaged research aimed at constituting a social context that forms the focus of interest. The researcher's social and political interest is evident here. Footnote: the most interesting project in this context is the TUP. See Egon Becker, Jürgen Ritzert, Text Interpretation and Teaching Practice. Research project starting in 1972. See also Egon Becker, Hauke Brunkhorst et al.'s Project Work as Learning Process, Project Group on Text Interpretation and Teaching Practice. See Kornelia Hafner, Interim Report on the First Stage of Supplementary Studies in Educational Science, 1974-75. In Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's book, The Pentagram Causes Me Pain, on Education, Socialization, and Time, forthcoming. End footnote. Regarding the development of the dialogue between social science and Marxism, one must first examine the evolution that unfolded in four stages. 1. The dialogue with the contemporary Marxism of the Second International was in full swing during the 1890s. It focused primarily on economics and philosophy. Common ground was also found in a shared interest in socioeconomics and social history, conceived as a historical empirical science, albeit based on a rather marginal understanding of Marx, with the exception of discussions concerning Marxist theory itself. Elements of a positivist, quote, social sociology began to emerge. This cooperation continued until 1933. Two, critical theory absorbed these tendencies, but mediated through the, quote, Weberian Marxism of Lukács, shifted the focus to different areas: epistemology, moral philosophy, the philosophy of history, psychology, and aesthetics. This school became particularly influential after 1945. Two historically significant moments characterize this period. A, in contrast to the emerging sociological functionalism, emphasis was placed on reflecting upon the nature of the discipline itself, that is, the philosophy of social science. B, there was a move to draw more closely upon Marxian theory for philosophical, political, social, and methodological reasons. New ideas were articulated regarding social science. Interventions concerning sociological theorists constituted one aspect, while the other involved an attempt to shift social science, reminiscent of Hegel's approach, toward a comprehensive formulation of the social sciences. 3, seemingly detached from these debates, a discussion is taking place that was prompted by a political aim, to gain a better understanding of working class consciousness, particularly in light of the institutionalization of trade unions. Marx already addressed this issue. This is in fact the debate associated with apparismo. 4. A new debate, and thus a resumption of the, quote, dialogue, has recently been unfolding. The aim here is to pick up the thread of post-war developments outside the realm of capital C critical theory, its critique of positivism, and its engagement with traditional sociology. Although Marx wrote his Workers' Inquiry as early as 1880, references to it appear to have remained marginal. The specific situation in Italy during the 1950s had led, on the one hand, to a policy of partial integration involving left-wing parties and trade unions, and on the other had reinforced a trend toward greater independence among their respective left wings. Biographies of Raniero, Pansieri, and Romano Alquati serve as indicators of this. Guided by the motto of, quote, renewing Marxism, and partly incorporating elements of council communism and the commune tradition, The left wing began calling for a movement built from the bottom up for new institutions, akin to the nascent attempts seen in the 19th century, and for workers' control. The journal Quaderni Rossi was founded. A debate unfolded there between the poles of autonomia and a dialogue with radical sociology, although Romano Alquati repeatedly pointed out the limitations of the latter. Followers of Panzieri, Wieser, and Alquati continued their debate on Marxian and sociological theory, yet no consensus was reached regarding the status of sociology versus Marxian theory. Organized cooperation also extended to Emilio Soav's group, which sought to bring elements of this debate into the PCI. The reception of sociological approaches shifted from Max Weber and Galvano della Volpe toward newer theories, and influence grew within trade union circles as well. This led to the founding of numerous aparista workerist groups, ranging from Class Operaia and the circles around Tronti's Patele Operaio to Lata Continua and Democrazia Proletaria. Despite the sociological and economic eclecticism and the shortcomings in theoretical reception, the questions of, quote, workers' inquiry and the search for a perspective based on a grassroots project remain central, especially given the propaganda of integrated trade unions and the PCI's emergence as a new national, quote, People's Party. The extent to which the reception of aparismo has so far failed to do justice. The extent to which the reception of aparismo has so far failed to do justice to the movement's actual history is evident in the traditionally narrow perspective through which it is viewed. Discourse regarding the, quote, ideology of workers' self-management, end quote, which abstracts from actual problems, demonstrates this just as clearly as the fact that accounts such as rights focus on the traditionalist wing of aparismo. The themes of workers' inquiry and workers' democracy remain excluded. This differs from the discussion surrounding aparismo elsewhere. That's interesting. I wonder what would constitute the non-traditionalist wing. Similar questions were raised in the German debate, and elements of the Italian discussion were subsequently incorporated. Three aspects of this reception can be distinguished: sociological theory, Marxist discussion and politics, alongside the reception and reproduction of aparismo in its innovative and eclectic presentation. Methodological considerations were translated into political dimensions and accompanied by sociological, economic, and social historical research. This is also where the closest affinity to critical sociology is found. The fact that the inquiry papers were virtually ignored, as workplace-based activism was gradually abandoned, and activists underwent a self-transformation, moving into the ecological movement and later into political liberalism, demonstrates that both the critical movement and the dialogue it had initiated had come to an end. Yet the problems they addressed remained. Certain questions have not disappeared from the debates in the intervening years. For some time now, one could speak of a renaissance of this dialogue. In both Marxist and sociological debates, classic themes such as money, capital, credit, and labor are gradually resurfacing, gaining renewed relevance amidst crisis-ridden developments. Increasingly, however, attention is also being directed toward areas linked to the concepts of society and class. Among many other ways of addressing this subject, society often appears as the sum of various societal aspects, subdisciplinary categorizations, and elements of civil society. Society is discussed as a specific structure based on systems of action, in order to emphasize the relevance of the social sciences, or it forms the formal framework of a social philosophical theory of society. It is also addressed in the Weberian formulation, so that its content can be transformed into the terms of the debate on the knowledge of society, thereby allowing for a more precise determination of the relationship between pragmatic knowledge, social scientific theory, and societal practice. Although society remains largely a formal or historiographical premise here, its conceptualization goes beyond the, quote, elite circulation variant. Schumpeter's image of society is a double-decker bus, where some passengers ascend while others descend. But who is the bus driver? When the analysis of society becomes the direct focus, the forms Marx targeted, which included the self-reflection of science, are already incorporated. There's footnotes here. Footnote: the fact that no significant cooperation emerged here either points to a fundamental problem in the relationship between political interventionists and sociology, industrial and labor sociology. This is already the case in the 1950s. Major differences between established sociology and Socialisme Barbarie, particularly regarding methodology and research perspective, characterized the debate in which both sides exchanged views. Yet a debate did take place, at least. At the same time, the author, see regarding the French situation, Andrea Gabler, in Tizi Pirta, Autonomie. At the same time, the author underestimates the complexity of apparismo. Consequently, due to her overly broad analytical framework, she fails to define the relationship between apparismo and Socialisme Barbarie. End footnote. Footnote: or there was a return to classical trade union interpretation. Bojadjev, that's my best guess. Bojadz with like an inverted, like upside down arrow over the Z. Ijef. Ijev, excuse me. So Bojadjev also employs this approach, albeit to emphasize the perspectives of racism, migration, and feminism beyond the trade union context, although she refers to the RK's work regarding women and seeks to tie it back to a feminist framework. Her scathing verdict lacks source-based evidence. Her claim that Lotta Continua failed to develop, quote, forms of action capable of linking the legal status of migrants with the, quote, organization of labor is unsubstantiated. Her disregard for practices of appareist groups is matched by her disregard for the differences between the various groups, even within West Germany. Despite similar references to apparismo, these groups differed from one another. Only the RK could be considered close to Lotta Continua. The MAO, for instance, prioritized different issues. The same applies to the group Arbeitersache, the Mercedes group, the BMW groups, and the Proletarische Front in Bremen and Hamburg. Only the PL/PI deviates from these points of reference. Accordingly, a thorough analysis would need to examine these diverse approaches, including those of the Italian groups extending to Democrazia Proletaria. End footnote. Back to the body. The discussion surrounding the concept of class has in fact never really ceased. It has moved beyond the initial sociological starting point of stratum-specific and classificatory definitions. Furthermore, amidst the political climate of the 1980s and 1990s, it has in places been transformed into a concept of class, expanded to include cultural dimensions. Quote, despite these changes, the Western bourgeoisie still stands at the helm of a stable and viable social order that has not yet reached its phase of decline. Its rule is firmly established. The threat of socialism is theoretical, ... The policies of labor parties and trade unions, ... are reformist, and class collaboration is a fact in Western Europe, end quote. Lucien Goldman. This is precisely the point where a reflection on the theorems of critical sociology and on the debate regarding the formation of class-based consciousness could resume. Here the task would be to articulate a critical perspective, both political and research-oriented, in the same pronounced manner seen, for instance, in the discussion surrounding Lenin. Footnote. Such a perspective would, however, have to break free from pre-critical aspects of how the areas in question have been received, aspects rooted in the very moment of political theoretical reception, appropriation, and incorporation. Examples of this include the SDS as a newly defined subdivision within the party Die Linke. or the perspective of social policy as an element of oppositional trade unionism, as seen in the journal Express. In the case of the former grouping, the intended content of this affiliation remains unclear. There are three possible interpretations. A, which SDS is meant as the point of connection? The organization of Social Democratic Wehrmacht lieutenants from shortly after World War II, the one associated with the left social democratic efforts of the 1950s, the reformist left oppositionist Sozialistischer Bund, or the radical left SDS. B, one might view all these iterations as a unified whole and a framework regarding one's own student organization as being in a state of open-ended development. Or C, one might attempt to bind the elements of critical engagement and affirmative traditional political engagement together in a centrist conception of unity. Similar risks apply to Express. In its drive for a unified trade union opposition, it may succumb to the temptation of interpreting the differences, which stem from diverse, sometimes localized viewpoints or political perspectives, in a way that negates their specific qualities, and it may find itself compelled to shift toward a model of, quote, process organization, quote. Back to the body. Therefore, two approaches to interpretation will be briefly examined here by way of example. Before turning to them, however, an interim remark is in order. An interim remark, the classes. Quote, where culture ends, the Masur, M-A-S-U-R, begins, end quote. And that quote is from Wolfgang Kupen in a piece titled First Reading Experiences, published in 1975. Back to the body. In the conception of liberal philosophy, following the model of Rousseau or that of simple commodity circulation, there appears to exist only the equality of citizens who, through free choice, decide upon the well-being of the polis. A notion of inequality, Rousseau notwithstanding, does not exist. A notion of inequality, Rousseau notwithstanding, does not exist. Footnote. Micheia 2, I don't know if this is, I'm saying that right. Micheia 2 sketches a harmonistic picture of liberalism. Micheia's approach focuses on the opinions of philosophers rather than their theories, speaking for instance of the cynical Mandeville and the serene Hume, left unaddressed is the fact that, in the classical society of self-interest, violence is eliminated through the transfer of power, Hobbes, or pacified through a social contract, Locke, One thus finds oneself back in the oscillation between, quote, realism and morality. See Jean-Claude Micheia, The Realm of the Lesser Evil on Liberal Society, published in Berlin, 2014. End footnote. Back to the body. If the question of social differences occupies sociology and the social sciences alike, for critical sociology this presents itself as a specific alternative. Social differences are classes. When Weber conceptualizes classes, he relates them specifically to the economy, a perspective that profoundly influences later conceptions of capitalism. For Weber, classes and their, quote, mass action are understood as emerging from class situations. They are formally contrasted with individual interests oriented toward the market. Theories of, quote, new social inequalities, end quote, build upon this foundation. These theories presuppose an erosion of social entities and a process of decentering. In modernity, they postulate a structural rupture in society that leads to pluralization, indeed to a general surge in individualization. Crucial to these conceptualizations is the initial linking of Weber's class concept to the market, allowing interest to be traced back to distributional conflicts in the market itself. Footnote. According to Hartmut Rosa, this, and this is in reference, what's this footnote in reference to? This footnote's in reference to the line, when Weber conceptualizes class, Weber relates classes specifically to the economy, a perspective that profoundly influences later conceptions of capitalism. And the footnote says, according to Hartmut-Rosa, this extends to the, quote, self-relation of the actors, end quote, and their individual self-interpretations. See Hartmut-Rosa, Capitalism as a Spiral of Dynamization, Sociology as Social Critique. End footnote. Footnote, market interest, i.e. interest in market opportunities, had to assert itself against the estate-based order and diverse cultures. This consciousness stands in contrast to that of, quote, cultural valuations, end quote, such as honor, an element of the aristocratic lifestyle. Questions of power and domination are to be set aside here for the time being. Next footnotes in relation to the line. These theories presuppose an erosion of social entities and a process of decentering in modernity. And the footnote says, this is historically ignorant insofar as it presupposes the prior existence of a unified whole. The novels of Balzac and Hugo can be drawn upon to describe the differentiated nature of the bourgeois class. Modernity emerges from the estate-based order. Regarding the issue of class and the transformation of the bourgeois d'ancien regime, see the remarks by Diethard Behrens in the piece Interest Classes and Comtean Philosophy in the Context of Social History. And footnote. Footnote. Interest, understood as rational, undermines norms and cultural milieus. Parenthesis, erosion, in parenthesis. Markets and market-based distribution entail tracing social inequality back to, quote, processes of unequal distribution of life chances and life risks, end quote. And I think that quote is Jürgen Ritzert. End footnote. In this context, a shift in focus from the economy to power also takes place. At the same time, neo-Weberian approaches frequently take the possession of assets as a given starting point, designating the market as the central determinant of class. In this respect, a process of further differentiation regarding the nature of class emerges. Footnote. There are then occupational classes, performance classes, knowledge classes, and provision classes. In short, as many classes, quote, as there are diverse types of assets as well as practical and cognitive competencies, quote. Jürgen Ritzert. The further assumption then leads to individualization and a pluralization of, quote, social discrepancies, end quote, within the perspective of a completely new society. And footnote, back to the body, claims that, quote, social inequality based on class criteria, end quote, is dissolving, implying a structural rupture driven by environmental problems and global catastrophes, or a transformation linked to the rise of service and information society, not only presuppose the integration of the working class on the one hand and the emergence of new lifestyles on the other, but also invite criticism that this amounts to a new lack of commitment or represents a, quote, candid form of scholarly partisanship, end quote. Inequality continues to appear as the outcome of market-based distribution. Nevertheless, following Turin, the view persists that a, quote, class society without classes, end quote, that is, one with multiple centers of power, exists. Footnote. Ritzert criticizes the following points here. There's a lack of clarity regarding the concept of concretion, the weighting of factors, and the, quote, relationship between positions of inequality and consciousness of inequality, end quote. Jürgen Ritzert. The empirical basis is weak. This appears to be the reason for once again pinning hopes on state policy. End footnote. Back to the body. In a modern society conceptualized as increasingly differentiated, the very notions of quote society and quote social reality begin to lose their definition. With the intensifying pluralization of lifestyles, societal distinctions also vanish. What remains is the milieu, defined as, quote, the entire environment of what is given to an individual, unquote, and comprising elements ranging from the material to the moral. End footnote. Footnote. The pluralized society comprises subsystems, economy, law, politics, science, religion, education, with diverse components and inequalities. Inequality is partly anthropologized or appears as an element of social philosophy, norms, and subjective preferences. End footnote. There now exist varieties of lifestyles as well as, quote, infinite diversity and heterogeneity of dimensions of inequality, end quote. Jürgen Ritzert. This leads to the thesis of a surge in individualization within contemporary society, suggesting that in the face of the disintegration of the life world and the fragmentation of the social world, all that remains is the perception of a, quote, socialization of individuals, end quote. The, quote, open middle-class society, end quote, and the, quote, risk society present themselves in neo-Weberian terms. The economy appears subcutaneously within, quote, modernization risks, end quote. Risks that are also conceived as marketable commodities. It is argued that individual life trajectories have displaced collective ones in the society of individuals, this newly privatized life world. Yet the economy and antagonistic structures reemerge contra intentionem. Footnote. In any case, class terminology is finally discarded here. End footnote. Footnote. It should be added that, as in the early 19th century, individualization in this context means that social crises appear as illnesses and are shifted through individualization into sickness and neurosis, a point Ritzert himself recognizes. Back to the body. Subsequently, two critical variations of this theorizing focus on specific constituent elements emerge. Both address the critique of capitalism. From a democratic perspective, Lessenich, Lessennich, argues the aim is to develop a, quote, historico-critical sociology of the, quote, active society, end quote, end quote. In doing so, he addresses what is, for the time being, the most recent ideational configuration of a capitalist nature. Since the era of, quote, Fordism, there has been a shift at both state and societal levels, resulting in a, quote, state-organized process of capitalist institution building, unquote. The state and the economy must be discussed in conjunction, as they have been since the days of the welfare state, if only because capitalism is, quote, a politico-social regime, unquote. The economy and the state must be complemented by democracy, a concept pointing to opportunities for participation and room for maneuver. Given that freedom of contract exists under capitalism, this implies the mobilization and demobilization of the workforce. The norm of a general, quote, readiness for activity, unquote, is established in the same way as the, quote, economization of the social, unquote, understood as the privatization of traditional welfare. However, the self-mobilizing, quote, active society, unquote, also presents itself as a site of social inequality. Yet, since control and activation stand in contradiction to one another, scope for maneuver emerges here, situated, so to speak, in the interstices of a society conceived in individualistic terms. Footnote. See Stefan Lesenich's Mobility or Lesenich's article or chapter, Mobility and Control on the Dialectic of the Active Society. This approach links the theories of Marx and Foucault, or to put it another way, Marx is overlaid with Foucault. Marx and Foucault pointed to the freedom and unfreedom of labor, to coercion and, quote, potentials for resistance, end quote. Lesenich. And footnote. Footnote. However, the question of, quote, system compatibility, end quote, must be taken into account here, pointing to certain limits. And footnote. Footnote. The perspectives of economic democracy go further. And footnote. Back to the body. Rosa, too, Hartmut Rosa, takes Weber as his starting point when addressing society. Hartmut Rosa aligns himself with the new tradition of an individualistic understanding of society without abandoning the intended critique of capitalism. Footnote. Rosa perceives capitalism conceived as a unified whole in Weber's work. A certain fascination shines through in this assessment. Yet Weber did, after all, recognize stratification. From a functionalist perspective, it is noted that the, quote, systemic compulsion, end quote, of capitalism must, quote, also affect the self-conception of actors who, imperceptibly, must frame their individual definitions of a successful life in such a way that they are compatible with the ethos of the successful producer and that of the consumer addicted to, or at least willing to engage in, ever-increasing consumption, end quote. Hartmut Rosa. Back to the body. At its core, Rosa's argument presents two theses. One, drawing a negative parallel to the futurist cult of speed, Hartmut Rosa characterizes capitalism by ever-increasing speed, which leads to the erosion of society. The, quote, deregulation of employment relations, end quote, further exacerbates this situation. This implies that politics and general subjectivity lose significance in favor of a, quote, situational politics, end quote. Nor does the subjectivization of work offer a way out. Thus a state of general alienation prevails. Finally, there are crises to contend with as well. Footnote. There is not only technical acceleration, but also a, quote, acceleration of social change, end quote. This impacts the concept of accumulation. It is the acceleration of capitalism that compels specific, quote, forms of subjectivization and identity formation, end quote. This is evident in Taylorism and Fordism, along with their counter-movements of, quote, destandardization and, quote, de-differentiation. Quote, social acceleration, end quote, also triggers cultural upheavals, provoking change that affects personal roles and extends into the family sphere. And footnote. The next footnote's in relation to the line. This implies that politics and general subjectivity lose significance in favor of a, quote, situational politics, end quote. This implies that democracy loses its, quote, role as a pace setter, end quote, leaving politically only, quote, muddling through, end quote, or, quote, adjustment programs, end quote, end footnote. Footnote, the, quote, subjectivization of work is therefore nothing other than a euphemism for the colonization of the, quote, sphere of freedom, end quote, by the sphere of competition, end quote. Hartmut Rosa. Footnote, this is in relation to the line, thus a state of general alienation prevails, and this is, in the footnote says, Hartmut Rosa refers to Rael Yegi, Alienation, published in Frankfurt 2005. Hartmut Rosa himself uses the term to mean a, quote, disturbed relationships of subjects to the world, and, quote, a disturbed, quote, relationship to other people, to society as a whole, to work, to nature, to the world of objects, or in the sense of self-alienation to one's own body, one's own desires, or one's own convictions, end quote. Hartmut Rosa. However, for Marx, alienation does not mean a disturbance. End footnote. Footnote. These are described in the spirit of sociological systems theory, and that's in relation. This is in relation to the line. There are crises to contend with as well, and the footnote says these crises are described in the spirit of sociological systems theory. Quote, modern society is a complex structure of numerous interlocking yet functionally largely differentiated subsystems. The education system, the legal system, the political system, financial markets, welfare state institutions, etc. End quote. It is noted using machine theory concepts that there is an excessive demand for synchronization regarding education, law, and politics. Functionally, one would have to posit the existence of flexible elites. Graph, by contrast, points critically to the stability of scientific elites. See Angela Graf's Germany's scientific elite. End footnote. Two, critiquing this development requires a focus not only on declaration but also on ethics. It calls for a normative morality of the practical. That is the idea of the, quote, good life, end quote. Quote, normative guiding principles, end quote, regarding this concept must be formulated, alongside, following Weber, the constitutive value ideas upon which the market economy, education, and democracy rest. Furthermore, one must ask why the idea of the good life is failing to be realized. Footnote, and this is in relation to the idea of the good life. This has, however, been a featured debate since Aristotle. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to the line, quote, normative guiding principles, end quote. The fact that these can not be summoned up parthenogenically, but rather that values and norms are specific social constructs is not included in the reflection. End footnote. Back to the body. The framework of these innovations has thus proven too narrow, particularly given that the realm of social differences has become largely marginalized. Thus, it is necessary to return to a form of theorizing that explicitly addresses these differences, namely social classes. To discuss the concept of social inequality with any theoretical framework that also encompasses class theory Reference is made to the theory of analytic Marxism and subsequently to debates surrounding neo-Ricardianism. This process involves a specific operation to prepare the conceptualization. As a first step, the complexity of Marxian theory is abstracted to such an extent that it can be adapted to and rendered compatible with the theoretical structure of analytical philosophy, an approach largely adopted by Ritzert himself, thereby allowing for its reformulation and redefinition. Cohen's work centers on a chain of concepts, productive forces, relations of production, economic structure, mode of production, ideology, and revolution. End footnote. Oh no, I said end footnote. Sorry. Spacing out. While Ritzert is fascinated by Cohen's functional applications, he criticizes Cohen's methodological approach, specifically the reliance on certain dimensions of influence and references for classification, as being too closely aligned with methodological nominalism, and regarding the concept of class, insufficiently complex. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote, and this is in relation to the line, thus it is necessary to return to a form of theorizing that explicitly addresses these differences, namely social classes. And the footnote says, this is to be discussed here primarily and by way of example through the approaches of Ritzert and Dürer, D-O with an umlaut, R-R-E. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it, Dürer. End footnote. Footnote. Koch also draws upon analytical Marxism alongside the discussion of class theory within the Klassenanalyse project and the work of Bourdieu. However, the study loses itself in the empirical quagmires of theories regarding, quote, new social inequality, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Analytical Marxism, Smithsonian Marxism, is discussed here using Cohen as an example. C.G.A. Cohen, Marxist Theory of History and Defense, 1978. Established at the outset in this context is the definition of the function, quote, as an expression, end quote, of a, quote, possible property of a state of affairs, end quote. Jürgen Ritzert. It goes unnoticed that the term, quote, function and, quote, expression differ in meaning. End footnote. The next footnote's in reference to the phrase, Cohen's work centers on a chain of concepts, productive forces, this is in relation to the productive forces part. Productive forces, this includes everything in society related to the production of things, means of production, historicity, and labor power encompassing knowledge. End footnote. The next footnote's in relation to economic structure. The next footnote is in relation to relations of production. And the footnote says, although conceived relationally, these constitute the economic structure and define the relationship between persons, groups, and productive forces. Here property is identified with possession. End footnote. The next footnote is in relation to economic structure. And the footnote said, this is said to be identical to relations of production understood as property. End footnote. And the next footnote is in relation to mode of production. And the footnote says, this is taken to mean a mode of social relations, a framework. Ritzert distances himself from this view insofar as he wishes the mode of production to be understood as a form of the reproduction process. Both interpretations miss the substance of Marx's thought. End footnote. Footnote. Cohen distinguishes between the ideal superstructure and ideology. As Ritzert notes, the superstructure is described as a, quote, comprehensive term for all systems or of statements or views, end quote. Whereas the, quote, superstructure, bracket, in the narrower sense, in bracket, is identifiable with non-economic subsystems, and ideology is to be understood as, quote, those meanings which, for social reasons, unquote, are on the one hand distorted, and on the other functional for a ruling partisanship. It becomes clear here that the classification system of analytical Marxism leads to continuous, increasingly formal subdivision. End footnote. And the next footnote is in relation to revolution. And it says, while revolution is usually regarded as total upheaval, it is to be reformulated in functionalist terms. End footnote. Footnote, quote, in the case of Marxist theory and research, Cohen's exercises in the critique of language justify a type of explanation intended to point beyond the simple causal technical linkages of the components of the productive forces schema, end quote. Ritzert. Thus, the discussion shifts to the issue, end footnote back to the body. Thus, the discussion shifts to the issue of exploitation, given that for right, for instance, class is defined by it. Wright discusses exploitation as a distributional problem within a society conceived statically, yet one where labor is nonetheless viewed as the transformation of nature to satisfy needs. Justice is thus understood as relational. Alienation is cited as a characteristic of class society, arising when workers lack control over their labor process and property relations are dominant. Exploitation is then defined as a social relationship involving appropriation. Footnote, see Eric Olin Wright, Class Counts, Comparative Studies in Class Analysis, and Ian Steedman's book, The Value Controversy, published 1981. For the interpretation in this context, only what is reflected in Ritzert's work is included. The problem itself and a more detailed discussion are to be addressed elsewhere. Regarding the latter, see the Kornelia Hafner transcripts. And footnote. Footnote, and this is in relation to the line, justice is thus understood as relational. And the footnote says, at this point, Ritzert calls for morality. Ritzert also locates the emergence of a lumpen proletariat here and fails to recognize that for Marx, this is a political concept. Footnote, this assumption serves as a point of departure for Ritzert. And that assumption is what? Exploitation is then defined as a social relationship involving appropriation. End footnote. Here, Romer, like Goldthorpe et al., goes a step further toward a social model theory. Starting from the premise of private property, the aim is to formulate a general theory of exploitation based on the assumption of market clearing equilibrium under varying conditions of exchange and purchase. In this model, class formation occurs within a closed system of labor time. Differing modes of market access, not unlike Weber's conceptualization in this regard, lead to imbalances. Value theory is also viewed as tied to the history of struggle for scarce goods, given statically conceived needs. This leads Romer to an assessment of exploitation based purely on moral grounds, to an ontologization of injustice, and to the assumption that classes exist prior to the process of accumulation. Footnote, see Goldthorpe, David Lockwood, Frank Beckhofer, and Jennifer Platts, The Affluent Worker, published in 1969. They seek a close alignment with Weber's definition of class. Possession, acquisition, and exchange is the basis of production. The classes are conceived hierarchically. The focus is primarily on an economy of time. The concept of value is excluded. Ritzert follows this in part. End footnote. Footnote. See John Ernest Romer, A General Theory of Exploitation and Class, published in 1982, in the edited volume Analytical Marxism. End footnote. Footnote. See in this regard. Footnote. The class structure is said to exhibit hierarchy, dichotomy, and a structure of credit markets that becomes increasingly complex as a result. End footnote. Footnote. It is posited that values are the result of prices. Knowledge of a maximum profit is also presupposed. End footnote. In Neo-Ricardianism of the Steedman variety, exploitation is emphasized as an appropriation. In Neo-Ricardianism of the Steedman variety, exploitation is emphasized as appropriation achieved through power. There are said to be, quote, social, technical, and natural, and, quote, factors involved in the appropriation of products. Goods with pre-established prices are implicitly assumed, a point overlooked by Ritzert, thereby allowing the explanation of the value formation process and the problem of commensurability to be negated or bypassed. Wages and commodities are thus posited as entities that already carry a price. Nevertheless, Ritzert finds that there are significant commonalities between Marxists and Neo-Ricardians. If one wishes to move beyond the realm of models and interest-driven reductions, it seems sensible to turn to Ritzert's own approach. Footnote. The constitution of values appears as a, quote, technological process, end quote, dependent on, quote, social recognition, ... by the market, end quote. Demirović. End footnote. Footnote, and this is in relation to the line, Ritzert finds that there are significant commonalities between Marxists and Neo-Ricardians. And the footnote says, this can only be accepted as plausible if the theoretical structure and content have first been leveled, i.e. made compatible, and the critique of political economy has been devolved. Ritzert's critique of economism appears to operate within narrow limits. End footnote. Back to the body, Ritzert attempts to present a system of social inequality. It has been conceptualized in contrast to notions of strata and simple top-down hierarchies. At the apex stands the concept of, quote, social difference. In the next step, social difference is distinguished from social inequality. Social inequality is defined anthropologically in contrast to equality, understood as simple individual identity. A distinction is made between opposition and social conflict. Surplus appropriation is then situated beneath the level of, quote, social discrepancies, end quote. Ritzert. Footnote, this is in relation to the line, Ritzert attempts to present a system of social inequality. This establishes a link to nominalist sociology while maintaining the traditional subject-object split. Footnote, the operational procedure involves the following steps: abstraction from surplus value, production in capitalism, construction of a concept of surplus production. Further abstractions follow, leading to the notion of a general ahistorical social inequality as the potential starting point for a deductive system. Footnote, the core of social inequality following Weber is assumed to lie in opportunities, quote, to dispose of coveted goods and services, of power and or cultural influence, hegemony, unquote. End footnote. Footnote: social inequality is considered a normative concept. The definition of equality and inequality is formulated following Quine. See Willard van Orman Quine. Quote, social inequalities in general therefore signify individual and or collective differences that, or the consequences, effects of which, or are, or can be, justified or called into question according to cultural norms and or moral political principles. Social inequalities thus constitute a subset of social differences in general, end quote. Quine. And footnote. Footnote: a strict distinction must be made between strict opposition, Quine, and social conflict. Insofar as social conflicts arise from social discrepancies, they are termed antagonisms. The concept of social inequality is intended to encompass A, the structure of a society as synthesis, development, and dynamis, as well as B, ethical, practical, evaluative norms. Quote, an antagonism is a conflict within a field of actions and counteractions, sociologically differentiated into a, quote, field of power, counterpower, or powerlessness, end quote, and in an element within a model involving exclusions, end quote. Footnote: the term, quote, social discrepancies refers to social relations within the societal sphere. For a critical and nuanced discussion of the concept of society in sociology, see Jürgen Ritzert. Society, Introduction to an Unfathomable Fundamental Concept, Parts 1 and 2. End footnote. Back to the body. The surplus theory aims to be both ahistorical and historical at the same time. The surplus is intended to be, both in general and specific terms, a, quote, surplus product, end quote. Classes are thus oriented toward the surplus product. At its core, Ritzert's argument challenges the assumption of a two-class model in which one class engages in useful labor while the other is parasitic, even though he occasionally employs this very notion himself. In short, surplus product is the result of surplus labor, that is, of goods and services. Within the general concept of surplus production, all civilizational forms throughout history are classified, quote, omnihistorically, end quote, that is, by negating their historical differentiation. This applies to antiquity, just as it does to the Middle Ages. On the other hand, it emphasized that while the surplus concept is general, it is not so general as to fit, quote, every social formation in history, end quote. Nevertheless, the following point is made, quote, the surplus theory of class formation has, a broader scope than the theory of capitalism, end quote. Ritzert. Surplus production is considered essential to the concept of capitalist society. Within this framework, the, quote, relationship between subsistence labor and surplus labor, end quote, is associated with that of, quote, necessary labor and surplus labor, end quote, Ritzert. This is possible if everyday time is distinguished from working time, the latter being a subset of the former. The concept of production is understood in general terms, since whatever is to be distributed must first be produced. Quote, appropriation as a production process involving a surplus product counts among the necessary conditions for class structuring, end quote. This also presupposes the existence of property. Footnote: civilizations are, for instance, described as, quote, class societies, and in this respect the, quote, history of civilizations is that of class societies, end quote. Jürgen Ritzert. Footnote. This is an interpretive framework that was in use during the Enlightenment and served to denounce the nobility as an idle class. End footnote. Footnote. Here one also finds a cautious distinction drawn regarding Weber's argumentation concerning market chances and his focus on power and legitimate domination. Footnote. Only hunter-gatherer cultures are excluded. It is evident that the universalization of elements otherwise associated with the class structure of capitalism marks a shift that borders on an apologia for capitalist structures in general. And footnote. Footnote. And this is in relation to the line. This applies to antiquity as it does to the Middle Ages. And the footnote says, this point is taken up in the summary of Turgot's account. Turgot maintains that, quote, production surpluses, and quote, must exist in all societies. End footnote. Footnote. The nobility, it is argued, is oriented toward the surplus. The nobility skims off the rural surplus. In this respect, a, quote, class analysis of a society of estates, and quote, is said to be possible. Here the concept of class becomes diffuse, merging class and estate into one. End footnote. Footnote. It is also argued that equating class society with bourgeois society is incorrect. End footnote. Footnote. This presupposes a fixed total amount of labor so that necessary labor and surplus labor can be treated as variables. Every time is said to be a hallmark of the, quote, individuality of subjects, end quote, visible in, quote, personal timing, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. And this is in relation to the line, the concept of production is understood in general terms. And the footnote says, this contains, quote, imminent references to the social time structure of the historically dominant unity of production and distribution processes. This structure stands in historically changing relationships to people's everyday time, which can be divided into working time and personal time. This would require A, working time to be given, and B, the task to be commensurable. Footnote. 4 forms of property are cited. 1. Property is the appropriation of nature through production. 2. Property is recognized possession. 3. Property is, quote, legally secured claims to possession, end quote. 4. Property is the forcible appropriation of the surplus, that is, as what Ritzer terms appropriation. Back to the body. The picture of capitalist surplus production can be further differentiated beyond the mere distinction between necessary and surplus labor, as goods and services are also included. To the extent that the master-servant relationship is also incorporated, the distinction between the critique of late absolutism and that of modern bourgeois society vanishes. Labor, therefore, lies at the center. The surplus is now differentiated into physical surplus, monetary surplus, parenthesis, where the expression of value in monetary terms is identified with the surplus itself, in parenthesis, absolute surplus, parenthesis, surplus value, in parenthesis, and temporal surplus, defined as the ratio of surplus value to necessary labor time. Footnote. Ritzer draws on Marx's account of the working day. However, wage labor and labor coincide here. The labor process appears, as it does in political economy, to be neutral, since only the result is appropriate in a capitalist manner. End footnote. Back to the body. Against the backdrop of a specific conception of capitalism, in which economy and society are initially equated, only to be differentiated later, a distinction is drawn at the outset between class situation and class. Class situation refers on the one hand generally to the process of social reproduction, and on the other serves as a means of capturing social disparities. Class likewise refers to the process of reproduction and to social positions. Inherent in the concept are a social ontology and a specific notion of the individual. In this regard, however, class is universalized and asserted to exist in all civilizations. Regarding classes under capitalism and taking a critical stance against Marxist determinism, class conflicts are dichotomized and classes differentiated. Since Rudolph's determinism is taken as emblematic of Marxism, and Lukács's concept of class in itself and class for itself are declared elements of an authentic Marx, the path to a discussion that does justice to the subject matter is blocked in intentione recta. The footnote says, my class define the unity of characteristics and set ergo that of a group of individuals in formal terms. And footnote. Footnote, the status of the individual is to be preserved insofar as their individual productivity is to be highlighted. Now this productivity, ranging from productive imagination to the intellect, cannot be denied a priori. However, setting aside any overstatements, its economic embeddedness and relative autonomy must be discussed. End footnote. Footnote, class status, group, bracket, Stand, end bracket, and the party are assessed similarly in the work of Weber and Marx. This conveys the impression of a heavily Weberianized Marx. End footnote. Footnote, classes are to be differentiated into wage laborers, capitalist agents of circulation, and peasants. Added to these would be petty commodity producers, superstructure workers, and bureaucrats. This is to be taken as proof that the, quote, two-class schema, end quote, has disappeared. End footnote. Back to the body. This leads back to a dualism of structure and consciousness, two elements for which a mediation must be sought, yet classes cannot be defined in purely economistic terms, given that they contain specific elements of consciousness and moral components, while also being linked to the superstructure in specific ways. Thus, one need only point to a central problem, quote, the mediation between class position, class consciousness, and class action, end quote, constitutes, quote, a key question of all class theory, end quote. Footnote. However, it proves impossible to move beyond the epistemological nominalist dualism. In this context, the distinction, quote, between, quote, factual structures of society, end quote, and the sphere of symbols, norms, values, rules, and knowledge is insisted upon, thereby rendering impossible the mediation deemed necessary. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, classes also depend on specific constellations of superstructure determinations involving details of the economic base, end quote. Ritzert. And footnote. Footnote. A critical note is added here stating that the deterministic, and it must be added, reflection theory-based approaches regarding class position and class consciousness miss the point of the problem. End footnote. Back to the body. You guys heading out?
Yeah.
I'll see ya. Sorry. The question of class theory encompasses the concept of the circuit, which at first step allows for the assumption of a general concept of reproduction. On the other hand, introducing the concept of reproduction requires a historical argument, thus the genesis of this concept is of interest here. To this end, Ritzert draws upon the theoretical work of physiocracy, and specifically that of the liberal physiocriticism of Turgot. To meet the requirement for a, quote, class analysis based on reproduction theory, end quote, a stage model of reproduction is presented. The starting point, therefore, is the general stages of reproduction, ranging from fundamental characteristics to consciousness. Footnote: in the capitalist economy, the rule is classes are represented in the context of a circulation of, quote, goods, value, money, and capital, end quote. However, this does not yet yield a general concept of reproduction. End footnote. Welz, W-A with an umlaut L-T-Z, Welz, to whom reference is nonetheless made, remains unmentioned in Ritzert's, quote, lecture. End footnote. Footnote. This documents the reversal of direction regarding the previously envisaged deductive system. In contrast to the notion of base situation superstructure, classes are identified within the process of reproduction, with class position posited as the objective object of the science. Footnote: reproduction identical to the cycle is to serve here as a model, as is the concept of reproduction self-relation. End footnote. I jumped ahead, that was on that footnote. Anyway, back to the body. Fundamental characteristics are established in abstraction from history. Footnote: reproduction identical to the cycle is to serve here as a model, as the concept of reproduction self-relation. End footnote. End footnote. Back to the body. 2. General stages of reproduction follow. Footnote. This alludes to the interconnection of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. However, the text's actual context is misunderstood, and thus Ritzert's assumptions lead to an apologetics of the circuit. Wage labor and capital are also assigned to these forms. Because these forms are adopted merely descriptively, it is political economy that is reformulated, not the critique thereof. Reichelt also goes further than Ritzert. End footnote. Back to the body. 3. A simple schema of the capital circuit is outlined, consisting of production, consumption, and circulation, which together constitute reproduction. Footnote. From the perspective of value theory, various distinct elements are conflated here. This stems from the fact that elements of Marxian theory and subjective value theory are discussed uno actu. End footnote. Footnote. Consumption is introduced here exclusively as, quote, small-scale consumption. End footnote. Back to the body. 4. Here the focus shifts to the problem of commensurability. It is suggested that Marx employs two distinct concepts of value. Footnote. This applies only to Smith. However, it is also evident that at this point Ritter becomes entangled in the dilemmas of simple commodity production. End footnote. Footnote. Surplus value is interpreted as a surplus. Excuse me. Wait, I already said that. Where am I? End footnote. Six. Thus, value appears as capital or as, quote, value valorizing itself, end quote. Conceived as a circuit passing through the reproduction process. Seven. Subcircuits of capital circuit involving commodity capital, money capital, and productive capital are also significant from the perspective of class theory. Sorry, one second. Had to come inside, it's starting to rain. Where the hell am I? Six, thus value appears as capital or as, quote, value valorizing itself, end quote, is conceived as a circuit passing through the reproduction process. Footnote. Quote, the realization of surplus value, end quote, is assigned to the sphere of circulation. We're now dealing with value as capital, end footnote. Footnote. Value is said to be a more general, quote, concept of value because it designates a process, end quote, in which the, quote, other determinations of value emerge as moments, end quote, to paraphrase the text. End footnote. Back to the body. Seven, subcircuits of the capital circuit involving commodity capital, money capital, and productive capital are also significant from the perspective of class theory. At this point, productive and unproductive labor are incorporated. Productive labor exchanges directly with money acting as capital. Unproductive labor, such as the services of circulation agents and others, is characterized by activities that are, quote, indirectly relevant to surplus value, end quote. Footnote. Given the complexity of the subject matter, Ritter here fails to maintain necessary distinctions. The most important conclusion is that one can effectively speak only of a vaguely defined wage-labor force. End footnote. Back to the body. 9. This step marks the transition to a description of class positions. Finally, the concept of, quote, interest is intended to mediate between class positions, consciousness, and reflection. Here, recourse is made to Max Weber. Capital circuits are crucial to Ritter's theory of reproduction. Take, for instance, the money circuit, money, commodity, production, commodity prime, money prime. All means of reproduction are supposed to be encompassed within it. Organic reproduction, physical reproduction, and the reproduction of both capital and labor. This is not a very precise conception. Firstly, what is involved here is the reproduction of value, of capital, whereas labor appears within this framework as merely V, i.e. as purchased labor power. Secondly, there is only an exchange of labor for money. not for capital that surrenders labor in return for primary and secondary means of subsistence. Thirdly, the reproduction of labor power falls outside these circuits. Fourthly, it is the labor market where labor power is bought and sold, and where capital and labor confront one another, that constitutes one of the conditions of capitalist reproduction, rather than being that reproduction process itself. Consequently, any class theory built upon Ritzert's theory of reproduction is bound to miss its mark, precisely because the class, the social object in question, appears merely as a moment of capital. Any class theory built upon Ritzert's theory of reproduction is bound to miss its mark, if only because, given the social object in view, class appears merely as a moment of capital. It's weird. Must probably fuck up on the translation for myself. It is therefore not surprising that a shift towards Weber is sought. Concepts such as interest and class, alongside references to market chances and elements like bureaucracy, the state, status groups, and parties signal this trend. Alongside various distortions, an impression of incoherence emerges. In a certain sense, the reference to private property remains intact. The attempt to reconcile Marx with Weber gives rise to problems of compatibility. It is worth recalling here that one of the differences between Marx and Weber is that Marx did not write sociology. Let us turn to another attempt to engage with class theory. This approach is framed against a specific image of capitalism, one viewed from the perspective of economic sociology. The starting point is the current state of capitalism. Here, according to the prevailing view, there exists a, quote, socialization through markets, unquote, involving a, quote, lean state that regulates them, while the system is held together by the, quote, moral self-commitment of its members, unquote. It is hardly surprising to find the protagonist engaging in an ideological glorification of liberalism. It is not only this ideological glorification that draws criticism which manifests in two forms: A, challenging the notion of optimization performance and its implications for the state, and B, seeking to understand, quote, capitalism as a market economy that constantly negates itself, unquote. Consequently, it is necessary to reflect on class theory and the development of capital itself. And there's a number of footnotes here, and I'm not sure necessarily what they're connected to. The reason I'm reading them all at once is because they didn't get picked up in the body text, the numbers. This aims primarily at the adoption of the concept of interest in the Weberian sense, and footnote, quote, classical modern class theories have highlighted tendencies toward the bureaucratically regulated exercise of authority in enterprises, Marx and state institutions, Weber, as a defining feature of capitalist development, end quote. Quote, the functions of the leaders and functionaries of the modern state apparatus make the, quote, mediations involving the determinations of the law of value clearly enough discernible, end quote. Footnote. This refers implicitly to Lukács. Bretman points to Lukács' role in providing the initial impetus for the renewed discussion of class theory. This is a study operating with a rather broad brush approach. And footnote. Footnote. In one instance, Ritzert attempts to supplement Weber via Marx, taking wage labor as an example. In another, the relationship is more clear-cut. While the reference to Marx and Ritzert's sociology is critical, even though certain elements are adopted, albeit usually reformulated or diffused, the reference to Weber is affirmative. To put it another way, if materialism is ensured by the empirical level of the sociology, the categorical conceptual level can be occupied by a purified Weberian idealism, an undertaking that is in this respect retrograde. And footnote. Footnote. Since the individualist theoretical perspective and the sheepish glossing over of private property, that is, the aspect of Weberian sociology that legitimizes capitalism, cannot be denied, Weber must be supplemented by a theory of social reproduction for the sake of both economic realism and the preservation of individual perspectives. And footnote. Footnote. Conceptually, the work represents a mixture of dominant Weberian terminology, Marxian fragments, and elements of analytic philosophy. attempting to link these with debates in sociology and sociological empiricism. References to Kant, Hegel, and above all Fichte appear elsewhere. The theoretical elements are adopted rather than grounded, following a, quote, building block approach. In some instances, the author resorts to stipulative definitions. This structure makes critical discussion difficult. End footnote. And this is in reference to Klaus Dürer's piece, The New Land Grab, Dynamics and Limits of Financial Market Capitalism. And it says, furthermore, there is a, quote, subjectivization of labor, and, quote, signaling that the, quote, life worlds of the subjects, and, quote, are being incorporated. This points to processes of capital valorization and their dynamics. However, their flip side also becomes visible. Devastation and new, quote, forms of subjectivization, and, quote. Addendum to the debate by Dürer, Lessenich, and Rosa. It is also noted that, quote, capitalism is identified too strongly with the generalization of the commodity form and competition, end quote. Dürer. Footnote. It is evident, for instance, that the, quote, economic liberal system of thought and its methodological individualism operate primarily with a concept, end quote, operate primarily with the concept of freedom understood as the, quote, absence of coercion and regulation, end quote. Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. Quote, market relations are based on, quote, self-interest on the one hand, while on the other they are regarded as the, quote, ideal case of free interaction, end quote, driven by the, quote, pursuit of profit, end quote, parenthesis, competitive capitalism, end parenthesis. Freedom of contract applies to the labor market as well. Capitalism is thus encapsulated by the formula, quote, market plus functioning competition plus freedom of contract equals efficiency, end quote. Klaus Dürer. However, there is also a somewhat sheepish reference to the state as a regulator. And footnote. Footnote. For Polanyi, this applies to the organization of conditions by capital. See Polanyi, The Great Transformation, Political and Economic Origins of Societies and Economic Systems. Positive freedom arises only through market regulation. Moreover, there has never been a form of, quote, pure capitalism. End footnote. Footnote. Dürer presents the following thesis here, quote, everywhere the strengthening of market-based social organization has spawned, as its flip side, a bureaucratic surveillance state that controls even certain basic economic activities down to the minutest detail. Okay. And, quote, where economic liberalism advocates open markets, civil rights liberalism requires a functioning state apparatus capable of providing legal guarantees, end quote. Klaus Dürer. End footnote. Footnote. Marx identifies a threefold negation of the market economy. One, the, quote, power asymmetry, end quote, concealed behind the exchange of equivalents, the locus of, quote, ineradicable class conflict, end quote. Two, the crisis-prone nature of capitalism, market anarchy, involving the pursuit of extra profits and specific instabilities. 3. The processes leading to a, quote, partial restriction of competition and a change in property relations within the capitalist mode of production, end quote, centralization, monopolies. And footnote. Back to the body. In light of, quote, processes of precarization, end quote, and, quote, social insecurity, end quote, the, quote, social question, end quote, and with it class theory has reportedly returned. Quote, processes of the destructuring and reformation of classes within the context of capitalist, quote, land grabbing, end quote, bracket, Landnahme, end bracket, end quote, must be analyzed using a, quote, dynamic class concept, end quote, designed to account for social non-simultaneities. Here, Dürer draws upon a specific interpretation of Marx's view of class, emphasizing the relational positioning of classes vis-a-vis one another and noting the absence of a causal link between pauperism and class consciousness. Footnote, see Klaus Dürre, Social Classes in the Process of Capitalist Land Grabbing, in Heinz Buda et al.'s edited volume Marx a Dead Dog, Social Theory Reloaded, published 2010, Germany. And see Hans Günther Teen, Classes in Post-Fordism, and footnote. Footnote, and this is in relation to the line, quote, processes of the destructuring and reformation of classes within the context of capitalist, quote, land grabbing, end quote, must be analyzed. The quote is from Dürre, and the footnote says, hence the aim is to develop a, quote, process-oriented class theory, end quote. The analysis is to proceed in the following steps. 1. The Marxian class concept. 2. Quote, relations between capitalist land grabbing and class formation, end quote. 3. And 4. Quote, transformation of, quote, class relations in the course of, quote, finance capitalist land grabbing, end quote. And 5. Quote, requirements for a contemporary class theory, end quote. Dürre, end footnote. Footnote, in detail, Marx's class theory rests on, quote, 4 premises. First, it claims to bring order to the chaotic diversity of social inequalities, end quote. Dürre, by describing class positions that can be grasped in economic terms. Second, the Marxian concept of class is said to be relational, the relationship of class to one another. This definition creates more problems than it seems to solve. When labor and capital confront each other, one has A, a consciousness that is in each case partial. B, this offers the apparent advantage of not having to dwell on the problem of class in itself versus for itself. C, however, labor and capital are introduced here as elements within the labor market, their sphere being the distributional struggle over resources. Parenthesis, a notion also found in Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Max Weber, in parenthesis. D, labor and capital appear as concepts immanent to society with any presupposed capitalism. The element of transcendence has vanished. Third, the Marxian class concept implies, quote, a specific relation to domination, end quote, Klaus Dürre. Quote, although formally based on the exchange of equivalents, the capitalist relationship of exploitation requires additional extra economic state political instruments of domination for its reproduction, end quote, Klaus Dürre. Fourth, the concept serves, quote, a critique of class domination, end quote, and social mobilization. And footnote, back to the body. An attempt is made to answer the question regarding the development of capitalism by employing a model of, quote, land grabbing, end quote. This model is patterned after that of primitive accumulation. It traces a developmental trajectory of such, quote, land grabs leading up to modern financial market capitalism. The concept of, quote, land grabbing can serve as a phase model. Footnote, the concept of Landnahme, territorial appropriation/expansion, is, however, analytically overburdened. Landnahme is intended to signify the expansion of capitalism and denotes a politically steered process. Here, for empirical reasons, Dürre also challenges the fiction of the, quote, doubly free wage labor. Even after the Industrial Revolution, he argues there were temporal disparities regarding labor. In this respect, the development is twofold. A, in capitalist development, within factories and capitalized agriculture, the exchange of equivalents prevails. B, there is a development involving both capitalist and non-capitalist, quote, modes of production and territories, end quote. Added to this is the conquest of external markets, quote, land grabbing, Landnahme, functions simultaneously to stabilize capitalism and to deregulate it. There is also a, quote, preservation and institutionalization of secondary exploitation, end quote, as well as processes of precarization, the creation of a reserve army of labor, and super exploitation. And footnote. Footnote, the, quote, chain of land grabbing processes is in principle infinite, end quote. See David Harvey, Der Neue Imperialismus, published in Hamburg, 2005. Kubela disputes the implication here regarding capitalism's capacity for regeneration. See Slava Kubela, the Hothouse Blooms, 2009, Why a Severe Global Economic Crisis Can Give Hope to the Left. Published in Slava Kubella's Class-Made! Contributions to the Relevance of Class Theory, published in Vienna, 2014. And the last footnote says the concept of, quote, land grabbing, this is in relation to the line, the concept of, quote, land grabbing can serve as a phase model. And the footnote says, it is said to be a hallmark of capitalism's capacity for reform. End footnote. Back to the body. The first stage is identified as that of primitive accumulation, characterized by overt violence. This phase is considered ostensibly concluded, rendering Marx's class theory, which was grounded in it, obsolete. Footnote. Dürer also considers Marx's argument regarding the reserve army of labor to be inconsistent. However, Marx did not claim that primitive accumulation occurred across the board. Rather, he described it as spreading regionally, meaning it continued over time. In this sense, it did not reach Scotland until the 19th century. The thesis that Marx's class theory is obsolete, or the related argument, is contested by, for example, Slava Kubela, with references, first, to the international nature of class struggle, which transcends the national limitations often imposed on class definition, and second, to the internal differentiation of these struggles. Back to the body. It is often overlooked that this approach draws a parallel between the phase of liberal merchant capital, the famous, quote, competitive capitalism, unquote, and primitive accumulation. At its core, Dürer employs the schema liberal economy, cartelized capitalism, Fordism, post-Fordism, financial market capitalism. Footnote, presumably conceived in parallel to Hilferding's finance capital. End footnote. Back to the body. In the work of Rosa Luxemburg, one finds a further development relative to Marx. The situation is characterized on the one hand by the existence of factories, capitalized agriculture, and commodity markets, with capitalism reproducing itself, quote, largely on its own foundations, unquote. On the other hand, there is exchange with non-capitalist countries, meaning the external market becomes a prerequisite for further accumulation. Footnote. Subsequently, Dürer, quote, improves the Luxemburgian analysis by means of a Luxemburg-Arendtian construct. To put it slightly differently, quote, building on Marxist theory of primitive accumulation and its reformulation by Hannah Arendt, Harvey proceeds from the assumption that, quote, capitalism always requires a stock of assets outside itself, end quote, end quote. Slava Kubela. End footnote. Back to the body. Fordism, as the subsequent phase, is regarded as a mixed economy involving periodic market openings and restriction, a, quote, institutionalization of, quote, worker power, unquote, unquote, is said to have occurred here, requiring a distinction, quote, between the structural organizational power and the institutional power of workers, unquote. However, this remains a simplified picture that needs to be supplemented by an analysis of the potential and limits of reformism. Footnote, a mixed economy supposedly existed during this phase, emphasized It is emphasized that this amounted to more than merely the absorption of the small business sector. End footnote. Footnote. Regarding the, quote, Fordist phase, reference is commonly made to strong reformism, i.e. the potential of the trade unions. However, the horizon of this model, as well as that of, quote, real socialism, end quote, is a restricted one. While one might point out that Marx failed insofar as the focus on grasping the, quote, prerequisites of a revolution, end quote, ought to have extended to actual practice, whereas the practice of reformism and real socialism was different. Kubela alters the meaning of this statement by generalizing it, giving it a political direction and concretizing it, insofar as this connection was present but not primary, by pointing to the pacification of workers by the institutional left. This addresses the relationship between the objective class as the object of socio-economic classification and the actions of the workers. However, the authors had addressed this statement in a manner that was simultaneously more general and more specific. Quote, all previous conceptions of the transition to socialism rely on models of direct calculation based on labor value and utility, models that Marx demonstrated to be impossible using the example of Proudhon, unquote. See Diethard, Behrens, Kornelia Hafner's Auf der Suche nach dem, quote, wahren Sozialismus in Anton Pannekoek et al. Marxistischer Anti-Leninismus, published in Freiburg, 1991. End footnote. Back to the body. The Fordist phase is said to have ended in the 1970s with demand-side management replaced by supply-side theory. For Dürer, this signifies the occurrence of a new form of, quote, land grabbing, end quote, that of financial market capitalism. A novel feature here is a specific globalism of, quote, world market-oriented enterprises, end quote, within the context of, quote, international restructuring, end quote. At the same time, there is a, quote, relative decoupling of the financial sphere from the real economy, end quote. The current crisis, and to some extent its consequences, is then described in considerable detail. One of these consequences is in turn a new form of land grabbing. The financial crisis, however, evolves into a societal crisis. Indicators of this include the reemergence of precarious employment conditions and a reserve army of labor. Footnote. It is here that he also situates the new social movements and the new individualism. End footnote. Footnote, quote, the most important changes, however, are taking place in the relationships between enterprises, states, and financial markets, end quote. The new social movements are fitted into this context. Footnote, consequently, there is a, quote, destructuring of, quote, Fordist class societies, end quote. Quote, the encroachment of finance capital increases the autonomy of management capable of strategic action, yet at the same time it expands the social base of the ruling class fractions, end quote. The restructuring then entails a renewed redistribution from the bottom up. Society, however, becomes polarized once again as a result. Footnote, the assumption of higher efficiency in financial markets is not comprehensible. End footnote. Footnote, the possibility of a, quote, renewed system-imminent transformation of capitalism, end quote, must be regarded as a, quote, real option, end quote. Dürer pins his hopes more on a New Deal. Dürer also notes the possibilities of a, quote, eco-social capitalism, or a new protectionism in either a social democratic or a, quote, authoritarian right-wing populist, end quote, guise. End footnote. As with Ritzer, the working class appears here as the resultant of the movement of capital. While for the former this is linked to the internal aspect, the reproduction of capital, for Dürer it is conceived in relativistic terms, an approach that also has a scholarly dimension. What is constructed in this process is a class that is essentially the object of the social scientist. It makes no difference whether one speaks of class position, objective class, or class in itself. Ritzer, too, had become aware of this self-imposed limitation, even if he did not reflect upon it sufficiently. Dürer also addresses this consideration when he notes that the remaining question is how, quote, an alternative, domination, critical, indeed revolutionary consciousness and class action can emerge at all, end quote, Dürer. Footnote. This regression is twofold, affecting both the social sciences and politics. While the social sciences lose sight of their initial internal disciplinary structures, as well as the genetic and method-critical elements of their subject matter and their own perspectives, politics use their capacity to link up with seemingly advanced developments as a pretext to abandon political reflection in favor of pragmatic functionalism, apragmatic functionalism. Within the context of radical politics, this debased state of consciousness is henceforth doubly cemented. End footnote. Footnote. It should at least be noted that Dürer fails to fully break away from the theories of, quote, new social inequality, end quote. The lack of homogeneity within the respective classes also drops out of view. End footnote. Footnote. His call for a, quote, social critique of social subjects, end quote, he himself seems to have economic democracy more in mind. End footnote. Footnote. Back to the body. This question cannot be answered directly here. Instead, reference will be made to a perspective drawn from the history of the labor movement. It is the early labor movement of the 19th century that must be brought into focus when considering class. The issue in question will be discussed using the example of the L'Atelier group, L''ATELIER group. Footnote. The emphasis differs slightly from that of Thompson, who conceives of class in essentially interactive and interest-oriented terms. In footnote. And footnote. In this regard, see the early work of Cuvillier, Armand Cuvillier, Un journal d'ouvrière, L'Atelier, I don't know. Back to the body. Examining the transformation of social conditions, characterized by immiseration, pauperization, the explosion of urban centers, and, quote, new factory structures, is the primary prerequisite for this analysis. Systems of poor relief and labor legislation had already been developed in the early modern period. They now underwent slight modifications. France, too, saw the emergence of the counter-movements previously described by Thompson in the English context, Luddism and political emancipation movements on the one hand, and the further development of fraternal societies and mutual aid funds on the other. Trade unions and associations gradually began to form. Experiences with industrial strikes were gained. Distinct social camps began to establish themselves. Reflecting the underdeveloped state of affairs, capitalists are referred to using 18th century terminology. Nevertheless, social groups and political formations are becoming increasingly differentiated. The repression of 1834 and 1839 also altered the general situation. Yet for workers to reach a common understanding, they require a press, specifically a workers' press. The journal L'Atelier exists within this web of relationships, discussions, and conflicts. Founded by socialists inclined toward reform, it serves primarily as a vehicle for workers to clarify their own views and to communicate demands and commentary regarding politics and social issues. It is a newspaper with a threefold aim: self-clarification, intervention, and reflection. L'Atelier embodies both association and cooperative. Its list of demands extends to the realm of municipal administration. With the defeat of the workers in the Revolution of 1848, the era of L'Atelier also comes to an end. Footnote: there is cooperation between republicanism and the early labor movement. One consequence of these debates is a changed concept of, quote, the people, le peuple. While popular in this form as early as the 18th century, it now becomes commonplace. Quote, terms denoting individuals in social strata such as travailleur, laboureur, ouvrier, pauvre, prolétaire, classe laborieuse, and la prolétariat are now subsumed under the concept of the, quote, people. And footnote. Footnote, a form of, quote, worker communism, end quote, begins to emerge, parenthesis, des amis, in parenthesis, and footnote. Footnote, Cabayism reaches only marginal groups, and footnote. The next footnote's in reference to the line, yet for workers to reach a common understanding, they require a press, specifically a workers' press. And the footnote says, this emerges albeit most briefly from 1840 onwards. Discussions regarding the organization of cooperatives are also significant. And footnote. Footnote. L'Atelier, a newspaper addressed to workers and collectively produced by them, justifies its exclusivism, firstly on the grounds that knowledge of existing conditions is best acquired by living within them, end quote. Anti-institutionalist sentiments are also rightly presented here. These sentiments are legitimized by experience with those very institutions. Both they and the, quote, institutional fighters, end quote, fail to realize that they are merely taking opposite sides of the same issue. End footnote. And this next footnote is in relation to the line. L'Atelier's list of demands extend to the realm of municipal administration. And the footnote says, this concept is said to converge with that of the workers' communes. On the dispute with the communists of Les Humanitaires, see a work by Ulla plus Kaditz. End footnote. This brief digression could only hint at a direction that would repeatedly manifest in new forms in the period that followed, the intent to foster a different kind of experience. Okay, and that is the end of Dialogue 2, which is a section of the final chapter of Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's Western Marxism and Introduction. The chapter is titled Outlook and Preview, the Dialogue, Sociology, and Marxian Theory. And the section that was the content of this video is Dialogue 2. Thank you so much for listening.